Joining us now to look at Nigeria's plans to cancel fuel subsidy is Johnson Chukwu, the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of the Cowrie Asset Management Company Limited. Good afternoon, sir, and welcome to the program. We have heard that the 5,000 naira will be distributed to alleviate some of the hardships that will incur when the subsidy is taken off. We want to know exactly whether or not you think this will be successful and if it really will impact those at the very bottom.
Thank you for having me. What I would say is that as it relates to the planned 5,000 naira up to 40 million most vulnerable Nigerians as kind of subsidy to alleviate the hardship that may be occasioned by the removal of subsidy, a couple of things have to be looked at. One, in the first place, the 5,000 naira monthly handout that they want to give out will amount to about 200 billion every month. And the GMD of NNPC said that we're currently spending about 234 billion every month as subsidy of petroleum products, based on the 60 million liters we talked about, 113 naira per liter for 30 days. What that means, we are substituting one subsidy for another subsidy. And I would actually want the government to tell us how long that handout will last. The handout, as we all know, is not a way to win people out of poverty. We need to focus on the critical issues, what we call the heavy lifting. I absolutely agree with the government on the need to take out the subsidy. I mean, where IMF and the World Bank on the need to take out the subsidy. I also believe there's a need to bring some palliatives in the interim to cushion the impact of the subsidy removal on the most vulnerable. But if you are going to have that 5,000 naira on an indefinite basis, you have not achieved anything, because whatever you have saved from the subsidy will be actually spent on handouts. And unfortunately, when you talk of handouts in the country, because we don't have a very reliable and authentic registrar of the poor, there have been questions on the basis of compilation of that registrar of the poor, the most vulnerable. So you're going to be dealing with a situation that could be prone to a lot of abuses. So I think what the government needs to do is take out the subsidy, plan for some cushion for maybe 6 months to 1 year, but basically build the structures that will make the economy competitive. Instead of actually sustaining the poor people on handouts, we need to sustain it by creating jobs so that they be gainfully employed. We need to build infrastructure and make it possible for productive activities to take place at efficient and cost-effective levels, so that we become a competitive economy. And that way, you wouldn't have the number of people that are poor. Most people will be able to get employed and they wouldn't need handouts. Handouts on a sustainable basis is not going to solve the problem, because they will remain poor and they'll be looking out for this handout. We need to fix the economy in such a way that people can be gainfully employed. Those who have the capacity to be employed can get jobs, and they wouldn't need handouts. So take out the subsidy, build infrastructure, create enabling environment with policies, and you wouldn't need to continue to give out handouts.
Well, I'm glad one of the things that you mentioned was to be able to sort of compute the actual amount that is going to cost to be able to put this into practice, especially when you've done so. You said every month 200 billion naira. But how implementable will this be, especially when you benchmark it against things like the CCT, which is the conditional cash transfer under the Federal Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs? How implementable will this be?
Well, I think the government already has some proof of concept when it comes to conditional cash transfer. The government claims they have a poverty register of the extremely poor people. There have been allegations that that register is unfairly skewed in favor of some segments or some regions in the country. So we need to bring in some balance. And again, that register will need to be expanded to include people who are in the very rural areas who have no access to funding, to financial system. Now that we have e-Naira. So what we need to do is use the wallet, e-Naira wallet, to avail those who do not have access to any of the financial services platforms to be registered under the poverty register or the extremely poor register. We need to have some balance. That's one factor. Because without that balance, you may end up transferring this 5,000 naira to people who do not need it. And there's also a risk that you could be the registrar that is highly abusive or that could be highly compromised, so that you end up maybe giving 10 million people who are extremely poor, and the rest 30 million goes to those who are already extremely rich. So we need to address that. Clearly, we have about 98 million people who are living in abject poverty, who are living below the poverty line. So if you take that as a basis, so 40 million will just be addressing about 50% of that extremely poor Nigerians. But that, having said that, there is clear need to cushion the impact. How you can reach out to these people is something that they have 6 months to work out on. With technology today, you can actually use their phone consumption. If you look at the average monthly phone consumption, that will give you an indication of those who are extremely poor. The extremely poor people are not using so much of data. They consume minimally in terms of airtime. That could be a criteria to assess or determine those who are extremely poor. And then you have to create in-era wallet for them so that transfers are done electronically without the possibility of cash movement. You remember, at the height of COVID, the government came out with Ghana Must Go bags, where they went to localities and they were trying to distribute cash. We shouldn't ever try that, given the advancement of technology. But like I said, the core of the problem is that you cannot sustain the poor people by giving them monthly handouts. There must be a terminal date for monthly handouts. The savings from taking out subsidy should be invested in those critical infrastructure that will enable this economy to become a competitive economy. If we don't do that, we have not achieved anything. We're going to replace one very weak, ineffective subsidy with another ineffective subsidy.
Mr. Chukwu, and hopefully some people are actually listening to this program and hearing some of the suggestions that you have. I want to talk about some of these structures that could make the market more competitive and productive. What are some of the suggestions that you have as to what can be done to cushion the effects?
Well, one of the first things we need to address is the level of infrastructural deficit. You see, you can't be a competitive economy if you don't have the supporting infrastructure. As it stands today, we don't have the rail network, we don't have transport infrastructure facilities. We need to quickly build that. If you take out that, if you consider you'll be spending about 230 billion naira monthly. I can tell you that 230 billion in a year, you'll be saving about 2.6 trillion, almost more than 2.7 trillion naira. And that is enough in 10 years to build all the highways in the country. Remember that the government plan the government medium-term development plan of 2021-2025 says we need about 350 trillion naira. A 234 billion monthly savings will give you more than 2.8 trillion naira in a year. In 10 years, you already have about 28 trillion naira savings. That's enough to build all the critical transport infrastructure we need. We need to strengthen our power supply infrastructure, energy. And as we all know, you really can't do anything without sufficient supply of energy, including human beings. You can't move if you don't have enough, you're not eating, if your system is not burning enough energy for you to run or to eat or even to talk. So no system, no economy works without sufficient energy supply. We need to address the issue of energy deficit in the country. We need to address the logistics nightmare we have today, particularly sea transport, sea logistics. But if you look at today, we don't have any single deep sea port. It takes so long to take out goods or bring in goods out of this country. We need to address those. If you address these 3 elements, which is road transport infrastructure, including rail transport infrastructure, or call it transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and logistics supply, logistic infrastructure, you're going to improve the competitiveness of this economy because people can produce at lower energy cost. They'll be able to produce higher quality goods. They can be able to export more goods. And once we are producing, you are able to create employment. Today, we're dealing with a 45% of unemployed youths. You are dealing with a 33.3% unemployment and 22.8% underemployment. So you're dealing with already more than 55% of either unemployment or underemployment in the country. You need to take those people out of the labor market by creating employment for them. That is when you can effectively reduce the number of people who are falling into the category of extremely poor. That's also the time you will be able to say relieve the government of the burden. The IMF, it's a World Bank and IMF are talking of increasing the government revenue. You can't increase government tax revenue if most of the people are unemployed, because you need to tax people who are productive, who are working. Today, we don't have that. So build critical infrastructure, transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure, logistic infrastructure, and then you expand that by also looking at the quality of labor, which would mean you have to invest so much more in your educational system. You invest in the availability of educational facilities, in the quality and curriculum of instruction in the country, so that the quality of labor that will come out, that will come into the labor market, we have the capacity to meet the demands of the labor market. And then you address the issue of insecurity. If we take these things holistically, with a 230 billion monthly savings, we're going to go a long way to begin to address these problems. I can tell you, the cost of building the second Niger bridge is not up to 230 billion naira. The cost of completing the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway is not to 230 billion naira. If we have 2 months of service, we can build a 6-lane on either side from Abuja to Kano. Just 2 months of savings. If we connect on the arterial roads, it's easy to evacuate farm produce, and then we can take them to the seaport, and we begin to even export fresh food items. We need to address this, and these are the critical infra. This is what I call the heavy lifting we need to do to position the economy.
Right. You've raised some very interesting points there, and but let me quickly go back to the amount itself, the 5,000 naira. How will it, help the vulnerable cope, especially when you take into consideration the rising cost of goods and services in the country? Also, I want you to touch on, there was a point you raised earlier on regarding extreme poverty and the yardstick to measure them. One of the things that you said was using mobile data to measure, if someone is actually poor or not. Is that a good yardstick to use to measure the level of poverty that someone has?
Okay, let's start with the last segment of your questions. In the first place, we don't have a comprehensive database to actually identify those who are extremely poor. So you have to look at proxies. What are those proxies? Consumption of necessities could actually be proxies. If you consider the fact that because we don't have data to know how much each household is spending on food consumption, what proportion of your income is going to basic human needs of paying rent, clothing, and food. So you look at what data do we have that can be relatively objective. And the consumption of our telecommunication services could actually be an objective criteria. The people who spend 20,000 naira, 10,000 naira, can afford it. If somebody cannot spend up to 1,500 in a month on data and voice calls in Nigeria, that would give you an indication that the person does not have the means to incur that level of cost. So you can actually categorize that person as extremely poor within the society. So that's a good proxy that we can have today. Elsewhere in the world, where household incomes are tracked, you could have used household income or household expenditure. But one of the household expenditure we have today is telecommunication service consumption, which can be empirical, can be objectively measured. So that's one factor. Then how effective will the 5,000 naira will be?
Yes. Yes, unfortunately, okay, yes, we are going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for coming on the program. Johnson Chukwu, the Managing Director of Cowries Asset Management Limited. Many thanks.